A volatile news day is often just a pileup of unrelated headlines, but today, the stories did rhyme. Voters tested the limits of party control. Courts tested the limits of presidential power. The Middle East tested the limits of diplomacy. Regulators tested whether they could still move quickly on health and technology. And investors, as always, were left trying to price the one thing markets hate most: uncertainty. This is your top stories wrap-up for Wednesday, June 10th, 2026. And the through line today is control. Who has it? Who is losing it? And what happens when institutions are forced to make decisions faster than they can explain them? Let's start with politics, because the 2026 map snapped into sharper focus overnight. In Maine, Graham Plattner won the Democratic Senate primary and now moves into a general election against Republican Senator Susan Collins. Plattner is an oyster farmer and Marine combat veteran who ran as an outsider and survived a turbulent primary season. Collins, meanwhile, is seeking a sixth term and remains one of the few Senate Republicans who has repeatedly found a way to win in a state that often votes Democratic at the presidential level. Democrats see Maine as one of their best pickup opportunities. Republicans see Collins as battle-tested, locally rooted, and very difficult to dislodge. Both things can be true. The fact is this: Plattner's primary win gives Democrats a nominee with energy and a clear anti-establishment brand. The interpretation is that the same qualities that helped him win the primary will now be stress-tested in a much harsher general election environment. Every controversy, every old statement, every biography detail that Democratic voters were willing to move past will be revisited by Republicans, trying to make the race about risk rather than change. In South Carolina, the lesson was different. Lieutenant Governor Pamela Yvette and Attorney General Alan Wilson advanced to a Republican runoff for governor after no candidate won a majority. Representative Nancy Mace, who entered the race with a national profile and a knack for commanding attention, finished fifth and was eliminated. Senator Lindsey Graham, meanwhile, won his Republican primary, preserving his place atop the ticket. The takeaway is not that Trump-aligned politics failed in South Carolina. It's more subtle than that. The takeaway is that in a crowded field, several candidates can compete for the same ideological lane, and name recognition alone does not guarantee organization, trust, or votes. California also gave us a clear fall matchup. Democrat Xavier Becerra and Republican Steve Hilton are set to face off in the race to succeed Governor Gavin Newsom. California is still structurally difficult terrain for Republicans, but Hilton's advancement gives the GOP a high-profile statewide platform in the nation's largest state, while Becerra gives Democrats a familiar governing resume. For investors, campaign results matter less for the horse race than for the policy signal. Maine could help determine control of the Senate. South Carolina tells us something about the balance between establishment Republicans, Trump-aligned candidates, and local political machines. California will shape national debates on taxation, housing, climate, technology, and regulation. These are not just political contests. They are policy pipelines. Now to the Middle East, where the facts are moving quickly and the risks are more immediate. Israel and Iran have again traded fire around a fragile diplomatic process. President Trump has been trying to restrain escalation, while also warning Tehran that stalled negotiations carry consequences. Reporting today described U.S. and Iranian exchanges, renewed Iranian fire in the region, and Trump's warning that Iran had taken too long to negotiate. Earlier this week, Trump urged Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu not to retaliate after Iranian missile attacks, even as Israeli leaders argued they needed to preserve deterrence. Here is the fact pattern. Israel wants to avoid appearing vulnerable to Iranian or proxy attacks. Iran wants to show it can project power and survive pressure. The United States wants a deal, or at least de-escalation, without looking like it abandoned Israel or tolerated Iranian aggression. The interpretation is that this is exactly the kind of conflict markets struggle to price. A single missile exchange may not change the long-term earnings outlook for the S&P 500. But the risk channel runs through oil prices, shipping, inflation expectations, defense spending, and central bank assumptions. If energy prices jump and stay elevated, the Federal Reserve has less room to cut. If the conflict widens, global risk appetite changes quickly. And if U.S. forces are drawn deeper into the region, the market has to reprice both fiscal and geopolitical risk. That does not mean investors should react to every headline. It does mean that Middle East risk has moved from background noise to a live variable. Back in the United States, courts delivered another reminder that executive power has boundaries. A federal judge in Boston struck down the Trump administration's $100,000 fee on new H-1B visa petitions. Judge Leo Sorokin ruled that the administration exceeded its authority, contradicting an earlier court ruling that had upheld the fee. The H-1B program is used by technology companies, universities, hospitals, schools, and other employers that rely on specialized foreign workers. The legal issue is not just immigration policy. It is whether a large fee functions like a tax, and whether that kind of charge requires congressional authorization. The fact is that the ruling creates uncertainty around the fee. The interpretation is that companies that depend on high-skill immigration now face a policy environment that can change dramatically through executive action, court order, or congressional intervention. For management teams, that means workforce planning becomes harder. For investors, it means regulatory and legal risk remains a real cost in sectors that depend on global talent. There was also another legal and political thread today, tied to the Jeffrey Epstein investigation. Leslie Groff, Epstein's longtime assistant, testified behind closed doors to the House Oversight Committee. According to lawmakers who discussed the testimony, Groff said she had arranged multiple phone calls between Epstein and Donald Trump before Trump became president. Groff has not been charged, and her lawyers have said she was unaware of Epstein's crimes. Trump has said his relationship with Epstein ended years before Epstein's 2019 arrest. The fact here is limited and should be treated carefully. Testimony about access is not proof of criminal conduct. The broader interpretation is political. The Epstein case continues to pull powerful people back into questions about proximity, wealth, impunity, and accountability. That chapter is not closing quickly. Now, let's turn to public health and long-term household economics. The Food and Drug Administration approved bemetrizanol as a permitted active ingredient in over-the-counter sunscreens. This is the first new U.S. sunscreen active ingredient in decades, and the FDA said it offers broad protection against ultraviolet radiation with low skin absorption. That may sound niche, but it is not trivial. Sunscreen regulation in the United States has lagged behind Europe and parts of Asia, and dermatologists have long argued that Americans needed access to newer UV filters. Separately, a government-commissioned alcohol review, published in the Journal of Studies on Alcohol and Drugs, challenged the idea that light drinking has a protective health benefit. The review found no clearly protective level of alcohol consumption, and said health risks can rise even at low levels. That does not mean every individual faces the same risk, but it does add to a broader shift in public health messaging, away from the old idea that moderate drinking is inherently good for you. And then there is Social Security. The trustees now project that the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund will be depleted in the fourth quarter of 2032. If Congress does nothing, incoming revenue would cover about 78% of scheduled benefits at that point. The combined retirement and disability trust funds are projected to pay full scheduled benefits until 2034, with 83% payable after depletion. The fact is that Social Security is not going bankrupt in the way a private company does. Payroll taxes would still come in. Benefits would still be payable in part. But the interpretation is stark. Waiting makes the options more painful. Lawmakers can raise revenue, trim scheduled benefits, change eligibility rules, adjust payroll tax caps, or combine those approaches. Delay shifts more pressure onto beneficiaries, younger workers, or both. For households, this is a planning issue. For markets, it is a fiscal issue. Social Security is one of the largest programs in the federal budget. Any serious reform would affect disposable income, labor incentives, federal borrowing, and political risk. Technology and space also had major announcements. NASA named the crew for Artemis 3. Randy Bresnik, Luca Parmitano, Andre Douglas, and Frank Rubio. The 2027 mission is now designed as an Earth orbit test involving Orion operations and rendezvous and docking with commercial lunar lander test versions, rather than a lunar landing itself. The Artemis program is still moving toward a return to the moon, but the sequence has become more incremental and more dependent on proving out complex systems before committing astronauts to the lunar surface. In artificial intelligence, Anthropic released Claude Fable 5, its first broadly available Mythos-class model, with the company emphasizing stronger safeguards around high-risk cybersecurity and biological misuse. The fact is that frontier AI capability is moving into wider commercial use. The interpretation is that the next phase of AI competition is not just about performance. It is about trust, access controls, enterprise adoption, and whether regulators believe companies can police their own most powerful systems. That matters for investors because the AI trade is no longer just about chips. It is about cloud demand, enterprise software budgets, cybersecurity, compliance, energy usage, and liability. The winners may not be only the companies with the best model. They may be the companies that can package capability in a way that customers and regulators can actually accept. Media consolidation is another place where scale is colliding with scrutiny. Paramount Skydance's proposed takeover of Warner Bros. Discovery continues to move through regulatory review, including attention in the UK and Europe. The deal is a test of how regulators think about streaming-era consolidation. Bigger libraries, fewer major studios, more bargaining power, and more questions about foreign capital and market concentration. The investor read is simple. Content is expensive, streaming margins are hard, and consolidation is a rational response. The policy read is just as simple. Regulators may not want a media market where only a handful of global platforms control the bulk of premium entertainment and news-adjacent distribution. Transportation and infrastructure gave us two very different stories. In Canada, police charged former Air Canada pilot Jeffrey Wall after alleging he operated as a captain from 2009 to 2025 without the required license for large commercial passenger aircraft. Air Canada said he held a valid commercial pilot license and passed recurrent training and flight checks, but acknowledged he was promoted without the necessary airline transport pilot license. That story is unsettling because it strikes at institutional verification. The fact is that authorities allege a credential failure over many years. The broader interpretation is that complex systems depend not only on skills, but on audit trails, documentation, and repeated checks that actually work. On infrastructure, the Gordie Howe International Bridge linking Windsor and Detroit is expected to open soon, and New York's Penn Station redevelopment plans again put capacity, circulation, and funding at the center of the debate. The common thread is that North America's physical economy still depends on bottlenecks: bridges, stations, ports, power grids, airports. Investors often focus on software and chips, but concrete, steel, and permits still determine how commerce moves. Finally, sports delivered both drama and politics. The U.S. women's national soccer team beat Brazil 1-0 in Fortaleza, in a match that featured 8 red cards for Brazil, including dismissals of staff and players. The Carolina Hurricanes beat the Vegas Golden Knights 5-3 in Game 4 of the Stanley Cup Final, tying the series at 2 games apiece, behind 2 goals from captain Jordan Staal. And off the field, Somali referee Omar Artan was denied entry into the United States and will not officiate at the World Cup, a reminder that immigration and security policy can collide directly with global sporting events. So where does this leave us? In the next 24 to 48 hours, watch 5 things. First, Maine. The early general election framing will tell us whether Democrats can make the race about change or whether Republicans can make it about risk. Runoff endorsements will reveal which parts of the state party machinery still matter. Third, the H-1B case. Appeals or new filings could quickly change the practical effect of the ruling. Fourth, the Middle East. The key question is whether leaders choose symbolic retaliation or operational escalation. That distinction may determine whether markets treat this as a temporary shock or a durable inflation risk. And fifth, Social Security. No immediate market move is likely, but the clock is now inside a politically uncomfortable window. The longer Congress waits, the less elegant the solution becomes. The closing takeaway is this: today was not just a noisy news cycle. It was a compression event. Elections, courts, war risk, public health, entitlement math, AI, media consolidation, infrastructure, and sports governance all collided in the same news window. Each story is different, but together they show institutions under pressure. Parties trying to control voters, presidents trying to control policy, judges trying to control legal boundaries, agencies trying to control risk, and markets trying to control uncertainty. For investors, the right posture is not panic, it is discipline. Separate facts from interpretation, separate headlines from cash flows, separate one-day volatility from structural change. And remember, the biggest risk is not always the dramatic event itself. Sometimes it is the slow institutional strain that builds in plain sight, until markets finally decide it matters.